Okay, it looks like things have slowed down a little bit. So, good morning, everybody. My name is Patrick Sullivan, and I'm the CEO of the Halifax Chamber of Commerce. I'm very pleased to welcome you here today to another one of our webinars, navigating COVID-19. Thank you all for joining us. We are in the midst of rebranding our seminars to try to move away from COVID, although I suspect it'll be here for a while. They will be called the Business Support Series as we move forward. So keep an eye out for those future webinars. There'll be many more coming this fall. Really looking forward to our discussion today. And of course, it is extremely timely as children returned to school this week, children and adults, I suppose, when we think of teachers and instructors. So many people have headed back to school this week. And we're pleased to be joined today by Paul Bennett, who has recently authored a new book called The State of the System. Available, I think you said, Paul, today? Is it today?
Yes.
So it will be available today, so you can order it from, let's say, some online booksellers, but you can also get it locally at Bookmark. So I would encourage you to make the trek to buy local, although it's wonderful to be able to get things delivered from Amazon. Also nice to be able to get out in Halifax and Dartmouth. So the book, The State of the System, explains how public schools came to be so bureaucratic, confronts the critical issues facing kindergarten to grade 12 public schools in all 10 provinces, and addresses the need for systematic reform. It sounds like a great initiative, so thank you very much, Paul. We had a number of members submit questions for you already. So I have those questions in hand, and we'll be pleased to ask them on your behalf, on our listeners' behalf. But if you have questions, please feel free to type them in the Q&A box at the bottom. Also the chat box, although I'd recommend the Q&A in order to keep things straight. Now, let me introduce our guest, Paul Bennett, a leading Canadian education researcher, former head of school, and the author of The State of the System, a reality check on Canada's schools. As founding director of Schoolhouse Consulting and lead researcher at Schoolhouse Institute in Halifax, Nova Scotia, Dr. Bennett roams at large, raising critical issues and producing commentaries right across Canada. Thank you very much for joining us today, Paul, and welcome to our webinar. I'm pleased to have you introduce yourself and begin your presentation.
Well, thank you, Patrick. It's a real pleasure for me to be with you today. I see it as an opportunity to talk about my new book, The State of the System, a reality check on Canada's schools. A chance to share with you my analysis of the COVID-19 impact on our school system, and conclude with a few ideas that I have for building back a better school system, one that will serve us well should we go through another COVID attack, or in the future, looking ahead. We should be thinking about building back better when we come out of this.
That's great. Well, I'm just going to tell everybody, Paul has reminded me that I should give him about 5 minutes notice, so we do have time for questions at the end, so I'll do that as we move forward. So sorry to interrupt you, Paul. Back to you.
The school system shutdown during the first phase of COVID-19 was very much like what I've described in my articles in the national media as a power outage, which essentially left students and parents in the dark, and educators themselves scrambling to master unfamiliar forms of education technology. This was unique for the school system because making radical adjustments, readjustments, and following lockstep with public health directives is totally unlike the school system, which operates in a siloed fashion. And it certainly upset the natural and normal order in Canadian K-12 education. What emerged to fill the vacuum was what online learning expert, one of my colleagues, Michael K. Barber, who's incidentally a Canadian, he aptly termed this triage schooling in the education ER, or emergency room, aimed at stabilizing what amounted to a shaken school system. you see a picture at the top of the screen of abandoned schools. And that was the case for 3 solid months, if you think about it, and then 5.5 months between the recess and the resumption of school this week. Now, we had 3 months of slapped together home-produced learning, and there were predictable results. We now know through survey research that we saw bored and tuned out students, exhausted parents, and exasperated teachers. Everyone seemed to share in that experience. And my book speaks to the system itself, which I describe as a centralized and overly bureaucratic school system, and one that proved to be vulnerable and ill-equipped to deal and to respond to the massive COVID-19 pandemic disruption. Schools were dismissed everywhere in the world, and everyone was left on their own, and it's almost as if the system disintegrated or dissolved. And instead of rising to the unexpected challenge, I think it's fair to say that provincial school leaders were traumatized like everyone else. And they resorted to what they were familiar with. They took refuge in clinging to comfortable structures, ingrained policy responses. I'll give you a couple of examples. Delaying e-learning implementation until all students had access to technology and the internet probably cost 2 or 3 weeks, and there are other examples. I liken this to, you get a power outage, all the power goes out. Do you think that you're going to restore power to each and every place before you turn them all on? I think that was essentially what happened. We now know that when it was all over, at least 1/4 of all students, not just in Nova Scotia, but everywhere, were missing and unaccounted for in Canadian public education. There was no tracking of engagement or achievement, and we are going to find out what the costs were. It turned out to be, let's be charitable, doing your best education under impossible circumstances. Or as critics have said, many of them have said that it was a failure of pandemic proportions. Well, where does that leave us in trying to build back the system? My book provides a very detailed analysis, far too detailed for me to go through it with you today, of how the system over the period from the 1840s to the present, but more specifically from the 1920s on, became increasingly more centralized and bureaucratic. I turn to the most famous German sociologists of them all, Max Weber, who gave us probably the most serviceable metaphor you could have. And it's called the iron cage. It's a bureaucratic structure that seems to trap individuals in a world of order, rationality, algorithms, and control. And it didn't start out that way, but I show in the book how it hardened and became much more bureaucratic over time. And I identify each and every source of the bureaucratization of the school system. But what happened during the COVID disruption was quite amazing. We realized how dependent students, teachers, and families were on provincial and school district directives when they stopped, and when it was next to impossible to direct people from one central location. The span of control dissolved, and let's face it, parents taught the kids with the help of teachers and made the best that they could. And in a weird kind of way, superintendents were on the sidelines watching. And even teacher union leaders didn't have the influence that they once had, while everyone's grouped in schools and they're taught in essentially a formal, organized fashion within buildings. So what I argue is we need cage-busting leadership to transform our schools into something that will be more robust and more autonomous, and the social institutions that are going to first and foremost serve students, families, and communities. And that's what the challenge is, I think, as we come out of COVID-19. Let's just say we need to find a new way forward. And 40 years ago, some of our viewers might have been familiar with school-based management. It was very popular in business circles. And the school system across Canada flirted with school-based management. But I believe the time has come to re-examine school-based management. We need to be assured the next time that we have schools that are autonomous, principals that can lead, teachers that can teach, and they don't need to be directed from a central authority. They have enough resources and enough capacity to carry on. But what we have is a school system that is so wedded to systematization and management from top to bottom that virtually every aspect of educational service is delivered that way. So what I argue in my book and elsewhere is we need a complete rethink of provincial and school district education governance. And we need to clear away all the obstacles to building a more agile, responsive, and a community of schools, not a system that hides behind barriers and is bureaucratized. But we need to first and foremost remind everyone that it's the students that should be in the foreground, and the bureaucracy and structures kind of get in the way. So without engineering and re-engineering a school governance from the schools up, I don't believe this is going to happen. And you see an example here, an exaggerated example from this political cartoon, where you have the ministry and the masses. And essentially, when you can't assemble the masses, people are left on their own. So we're now in a new world of education in COVID times. I think we need to humanize education and rebuild the schools on a student scale. And that is what I call flipping the system, or turning it right side up. And this is the new priority in the COVID-19 era. Decentralizing management and control by itself, though, is not going to make a difference. It's going to have little or no effect on what really matters, because we have to keep our eyes on the ball, what really counts, teaching and learning in the schools. But it is the first stage in an overall strategy to make our schools more democratic, more responsive, more accountable to those they serve, parents, teachers, students, and communities. Students, of course, have to come first. And this is best achieved, I would argue, in smaller schools operating on a human scale. That's our challenge. And since the early 1980s, a human scale education movement has emerged, and it's shone light on the critical need to right-size our high schools, they're far too big, and to create schools that are on a human scale. And I believe that they need to be have places for student voices, business communications. There should be business partnerships and genuine partnerships with parents. In short, smaller schools with a place for everyone. Teaching-centered classrooms are what we need. I'm sure that many of you are looking and you're saying, wait a minute, we have student-centered classrooms. What we've learned is we need teaching-centered classrooms. And teachers are clamoring for a much larger role in setting the priorities and determining what actually happens in today's schools. But we have, over the last 25 years, we've built up a lot of accountability, standards, and it's called neoliberal reform of education. And what it's generated is this weird new vocabulary. And Gert Besta, a very well-known sociologist in Britain, describes what we have is called learnification, the emergence of a new technocratic language of education. If you're as a parent, you go to a school and you find out, wait a minute, the kids are learners, they're not kids. You find out who's going to teach them. They're facilitating learning. And the school is a learning environment. This is actually the language of learnification. And the dominance of that language is a clue to the fact that we've really lost our way and become so systematized. You know what schools should do? Go back to what they do best. Teach kids to learn something, to learn it for a reason, and to learn it from someone. And that's what happened during the COVID interruption. You were face to face with your teacher and no one else. And so we realized what really mattered. So beware, though, of the school improvement industry. They always have cures for everything that's ailing the school system. And this cartoon is a prime example. They go into the schools and they try to tell teachers exactly what they need to do. And what they often promote are unproven theories, and they are not always based on the best evidence practice. And teachers will look at them and say, hold on, that's not what works in the classroom. And what works in the classroom is what we should be doing. Community engagement is what we really need. And we don't have to talk to business people in our audience. You know how hard it is to interact with the school system. Parent engagement is now part of the standard educational lexicon. But in practice, it's incredibly hard to find it exhibited, particularly during the COVID-19 disruption. One of Canada's leading researchers on parent-school relations, Debbie Peshor of the University of Saskatchewan, she makes a very clear distinction between school-managed parent involvement and genuine parent engagement. And parents can see it. School superintendents and consultants, and indeed many principals, honestly, they've got a lot to unlearn. And they should begin by listening to Debbie Peshor and those who believe that what we need is not a school-centered communication strategy, but a family-centric approach. Now, what happened over the 3 months of the interruption was what was happening, a family-centric approach. But schools were not adept at making the shift. And what we need is to embrace a philosophy of walking alongside parents and community members and genuinely supporting the active engagement of the families that actually make up the school community. Businessmen don't need to be reminded that there's a big disconnect in our school system. In fact, the biggest challenge for business remains the same as it was before COVID-19 and the disruption. I have a full chapter on the big disconnect. I call it the big disconnect, but it really is the student preparedness problem. And here it is in a nutshell. We have rising student attainment in terms of skyrocketing graduation rates, diplomas being given out. And yet, when we look at student achievement levels, they're either static or declining. So there's a problem here. There's a contradiction between the attainment levels rising and student actual achievement. How can students showing stagnating academic performance be graduating in record numbers? And since the elimination of the last Nova Scotia grade 12 exams in 2012, you should be looking at what the impact has been. Each year, the percentage of graduates has gone up. And we don't have any reliable measure now of the achievement or competencies of any of our graduates, nor are there any results reported to the public for the last 3 years. So incredible as it may seem, reported student results either languish or decline, while graduation rates have gone through the roof. If I told you that the graduation rate in 2009 and 10 was 86.1% and Nova Scotia was first in Canada, you'd say, wait a minute, I thought Alberta had the top school system. I thought Ontario, with all the funding, would have the top graduation levels. No. Well, now, in 2015-16, Nova Scotia had 92% of the students graduated with a diploma. And they stopped reporting that data. And in the last Statistics Canada surveys, the last 3 years, there's no data for Nova Scotia, not available. They're recalculating it. I think it's time to blow the whistle on the widening student attainment and achievement gap. And if you look at this bar graph, it's quite interesting. That previous bar graph. You see that the top school systems in terms of percentage of graduates are not the top ranked school systems in the country. So there's a real disconnect there. Let's move on to graduation standards, because that is really important. Universities and colleges are major public policy players in the Atlantic region, and they exercise a tremendous influence on policy. Maybe that's why graduation standards haven't really been examined, because rising high school graduation rates are churning out enough graduate fill seats in universities and colleges. And it has a way of dictating and skewing policy in favor of increasing the number of students who are qualified for admission. So we need to critically examine what's going on here. And it can't be the university sector, because it's in their interest to admit more and more students and fill those spaces. Let's go back to Myra Freeman's report, Disrupting the Status Quo, in 2015. There's a really important graph there, which I've reproduced for you. How prepared are students for university, college, and the workplace? Well, only 38% of community members, and that's you, most of you watching, thought graduates were well prepared for university or college. And it was just 1 in 5 community members, 18%, who felt our graduates were well prepared for the workforce. Now, even you bore deeply into that, and there's another one showing how prepared were they for the next grade level, and they're the same results. Not all that well prepared. So the report was well titled, Disrupting the Status Quo. I asked the question 5 years later, where's the evidence that the status quo has been disrupted? Now, solid foundations matter in bridge building, when you build a bridge to a college and university or to the workplace. We need to be looking at the preparedness of the current crop of graduates, because I believe that's critical to our success going forward, and I'm sure that you would agree. Now, looking ahead, we need to seize the day. What are the lessons to be learned from the COVID disruption, from my book? Well, first and foremost, provincial governments in Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and Newfoundland, Labrador, and Prince Edward Island, they've eliminated or neutered locally elected school boards. I opposed the school boards, and I actually welcomed their abolition in Nova Scotia, but not so that we could have nothing to replace them. I wanted school-based management and more authority given to the schools and more genuine participation. That didn't happen. Everywhere we look, and my book shows in detail in each province, we've moved dramatically, gradually, in the direction of centralizing control over systems. And without access to school-level governance, concerned parents, educators, the public, and the business, they're left with nowhere to turn during COVID-19 to address any of those problems. And this picture here is a classic example. This is a public participation gathering in the South Shore Board of Education. Look at what was defined as public participation. Formulaic, set-piece presentations, and a board sitting so far away from those that are petitioning that they seem to be afraid they're going to catch perhaps a virus. I'm exaggerating, but that's why school boards don't exist. We can build back, we can build better school-based management. Now, this is a little controversial. I like to throw out controversial things, as some of you know. So why not challenge 21st century learning? Most of you have been to workshops where everyone says 21st century skills are what we need. They're presented as a panacea. My book really goes into detail about be careful what you are buying when you hear preparing students for success in the 21st century. What does that mean? Is it 6 of these generic skills or 16? They all vary. And is it possible for teachers in the schools to actually focus on developing 16 skills? And the research that I've done with Research Ed Canada shows that generic school skills may not really exist. They certainly can't be translated into teaching and learning in the classroom. And if they exist, we need to make sure that they're measurable. And the research now in my book shows no one thinks social and emotional skills, even grit and I would say mindset, growth mindset, they can't be measured. So why would we institute new measuring systems based on that? We're better to focus on the existing skill deficits in, let's face it, mathematics and literacy. And here's a question for you. 50 years from now, what will be left of 21st century learning? I'll guarantee that the alphabet will be with us, And it'll be important to be able to calculate, and we will have the numbering system that we've always had. And I suggest mastering those will prepare you for anything that might happen. Now, when normalcy returns, you can expect parents to gather together and say they want to keep their schools open. They'll feel, oh my goodness, more schools are going to close. And you can expect parents and community activists to organize once again and save our school movements against what I describe as the relentless advance of educational centralization and school consolidation. I'm asking you to connect the dots. And the book connects the dots between the move to centralization, to bureaucratizing school, and to school consolidation, to administrative buildup, to the development of learning centers, of education centers, farther and further removed from students and parents and teachers. I think we need to step back and do an analysis. What's happening? My book tries, and as you know, I'm not someone who just criticizes. I always try to come up with solutions. I feel it's a responsibility. If you're going to raise questions and poke holes in things, perhaps, you need to be held to account. What do you think we should do? Well, my book is very clear. The whole last chapter goes through what I think should be done. And I think there are a new set of priorities are emerging. Put students first, deprogram education ministries and school districts, listen more to parents and teachers and the business community and the community members who care about education, design and build smaller schools that are at the center of urban neighborhoods and rural communities, not on the periphery, and don't require as much busing. In the wake of COVID-19, I think we're much more aware of the critical need for meaningful public engagement, to raise questions, to communicate with teachers, to help to resolve some of the issues we've got. We can't just leave it to the top administrators. We can't rely on them to do everything. We need to rebuild social capital in our communities and take more responsibility for ourselves. We need to revitalize local communities, and they need to have schools in them. Now, with my book, The State of the System, a reality check on Canada's schools, comes a call to all of us to turn the system right side up and construct something positive here. Don't see it as a threat, but as an opportunity for a more constructive path forward. And re-engineering the school system, in my view, is actually about taking back the schools. And we know now, after COVID-19, what the needs are, and it's time to take action. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to jump back on. Well, see, I didn't even need to give you 5 minutes notice, Paul. You were right on track. So you've raised a ton of questions. I'm fascinated. I've taken lots of notes here, and I should claim, sort of up front, that my wife was a teacher for 35 years, and an excellent teacher, I might add. Although I was never in her grade 1 or grade 2 or grade 3 class. But I know, given the amount of work that she did during the evening, that she was a wonderful teacher. So I suspect, I've heard some of the words that you used in your presentation in my home for many, many years. I guess I'm going to start out by sort of challenging you right up front. I find it really interesting that one of your last comments was, we need to take back education. I guess I'm wondering, should we take it back? I mean, I hate to say this, and I'm with the Chamber of Commerce and we talk to our members, but it seems to me that many parents are removed from the school environment now. Aren't we better off, this may be a controversial question, aren't we better off to leave it to the experts and not have parents as involved? Because you showed a picture with perhaps 5 or 6 people in a room. I know it was a small picture, 5 or 6 people in a room and many empty chairs, and that was supposed to be consultation. I mean, shouldn't the experts run the school system?
No. In fact, we have a technocratic class that's emerged, and my book details the origins of school planning and the development of a technocratic class of what, if you want, educrats who consider themselves to be in charge of the school system, and they can manage it. And look, the hierarchy itself is a clue to how the school system operates. We have education centers, which are at the periphery of the school system, not in the center. We have a hierarchy of superintendents. Listen to the names, superintendents. We have a whole system that is ordered from top to bottom. And teachers and parents and business community members, that your audience here, they're on the outside looking in. In fact, the book is actually subtitled A View of the School System from the Outside Looking In. And what you'll find is inside the school system, there's a certain set of mythologies that are perpetuated. You're familiar with them. We have one of the world's greatest school systems. True in some respects. We are above criticisms. We are good enough, or everything. We have a pretty good school system. I address each and every one of those assumptions in the book. So I realize that it's controversial, but if you take the time to go through my book, you'll see how I unpack that. On the question of delegating and decentralizing, school-based management is a very, very challenging thing to establish. Here's what I proposed to Avis Glaze, and this was what I proposed. I said, don't abolish the school, all the school boards until you've got a year of development of school-based management. You need to work so hard with those parents, with the principals, and with the community members to make sure they take advantage of a delegation of responsibilities, and then phase out the elected trustees and bring them back at a later stage when you need coordination on a regional basis. I believe they bungled the abolition of school boards in Nova Scotia. But there is a chance that, I'm going to make a prediction, they will be back, but let's hope not in the form that they had when they were eliminated. I think we need to go to school-based management, and so do most business leaders who believe that there needs to be a much more effective management of the school system.
So I have a question here. So from one of our attendees, would parent-centered engagement hinder those kids who have parents who are not or not able to be engaged? And maybe it's the same vein as my previous question, but.
I'm a big believer in listening to parents and teachers. There's a lot in this book about teachers. Teachers, I'm talking about classroom teachers, who are often the last to find out about a new initiative, and they find what's coming down the pipe and what's new this year. And there's a cycle of things. Oh my goodness, it's back. It's got a new name, it's rebranded, but it's something we did 10 years ago. And the people introducing it don't acknowledge that it's something that's been tried before. This is really what's happening. So, but I think your question is, how do we ensure equity across the school system? And I've got quite a bit in the book about how we do need to. Smaller schools are more equitable. Parents are better known to the teachers, and there's more reciprocity. So if you have smaller schools, you've done more than you could ever imagine for making them more equitable and more understanding and more welcoming. And everyone gets included because they're more obvious when they're left out. So that needs to be the philosophy. So small schools, by their very nature, are more inclusive and involving. So that's number one. Number two would be you need to have parents who are trained to be leaders at that level. You can't assume that they'll just step in and they're going to do that. And I believe it's not the council chairs right now. I don't think they were ever signed on for something like school governing councils. I think they'd be quite happy just, raising money and meeting once or twice a month with the principal and so on and so forth. We need to be redeveloping school leadership at the school level with parents, with business leaders. And I think there's a real opportunity for your chamber to be involved in a school-based management initiative to replace there's nothing there now. So what is the alternative? I think I'm proposing that that's an alternative.
Yeah, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. Yeah, and I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I think we at the Chamber were generally in favor of the abolition of school boards, simply because there were a lot of school boards across Nova Scotia. Believe it or not, we're a relatively small province in terms of the total number of students when you compare it to regions like Peel or some of the bigger school boards across the country. But to your point, there didn't seem to be anything put in place. And now the minister, and I'm making an observation, this is purely my opinion, it seems the minister has forgotten that he's eliminated a layer and now everything goes to him. Sorry, go ahead.
I think he's learned that it's impossible.
Right.
COVID-19 proved once and for all that no single minister of education or deputy minister can manage all of this. We have 395 schools.
Right.
We have 120,000 students, 10,000 teachers. This is not working. And you don't mention the Provincial Advisory Council on Education. Why would you? They're invisible. They operate, let me be honest, they operate like the Politburo. They don't issue any minutes. They don't participate. What Provincial Advisory Council on Education would remain silent for the 6 months of the COVID-19 pandemic? And they, according to their minutes, they never met. So when they're needed the most, they're nowhere to be found.
Wow. So another question, the Education Act in Nova Scotia protects public involvement in school governing through the school advisory councils. How does this model not meet your recommendations?
There I have some very detailed recommendations. In the chapter in the book where I talk about the crisis of school governance, I go through, and I use Nova Scotia as a case study. I identify the 8 or 9 reasons why those school structures collapsed, the educational democracy collapsed. And I show every single one of the example. I give examples citing that. So that system collapsed. What I do as well is I show how you can transform advisory councils at the school level to governing councils. And there are about 28 possible responsibilities that can be entrusted to the schools. We do have the Edmonton public school system as a model that I cite as worth emulating. And here, this is what a stark contrast it is. About 60% of the total budget in the Edmonton public schools is assigned to the schools. Wow. And there are guidelines, and they have to be earmarked. About 40% of the budget goes to equalizing things and making sure there's shared transportation, there's support for special needs and inclusion. And I think over time, to be honest, Patrick, more and more has been moved back to the center because there was more need for building equity and building bridges up between the schools. They went a little too far. I think it was originally 70% of the budget went to the schools, the principals, and there was budgets. They had a budget requirement that they produced the budget and they were accountable for them. Now, we only have 395 schools. We could easily do school-based management. It's not a huge undertaking. And this is my point, is we don't have 5,000 schools or 4,000 schools like they do in Ontario. You could argue that's really a huge undertaking, but I believe we could. And the difference between enhanced advisory councils, which was what was promised in the Avis Glaze report, and what we got is quite significant. I've talked to the Minister of Education. I said, my goodness, that is not what Avis Glaze recommended. Where's the enhancement? They have less authority than they did before, and they have none of the criteria that you would expect as a school, a self-governing body. In fact, it's maybe just false pretenses, I would say.
So let me kind of, you were headmaster of the grammar school, you taught at Upper Canada College, Lower Canada College. It seemed to me, with friends who have children in private school, that there was much greater, how can I put it? They were ready, as much as anyone was ready, for the pandemic. they were able to deal more effectively with COVID-19. They were able to provide more effective education. Is that, and I know I'm going out on a limb, but is that simply a money issue? Is that a technology issue? How do we ensure that our public schools can have the same level of education as our private schools, or is that possible?
Excuse me for just correcting one thing. I was the headmaster of Lower Canada College in Montreal,
sorry. Okay.
which is the largest independent school in English in Quebec.
Right.
And I came here to head the Halifax Grammar School. But I actually have 34 years of every year I taught. I'm one of the very few school heads that taught. And I have 6 years as an adjunct professor of education at St. Mary's University. So 40 years of education at all levels. I've been an elected trustee. So the book reflects a lot of my experience going back over a 35-year period. In fact, people are quite shocked that I'm still around. So, but your question is this. Why did the independent schools get favorable press coverage for being open and being quicker to adjust? The grammar school, Bedford Academy, they were on the front page. The school was suspended everywhere else, and they went on and they flipped a switch and they went right back to, well, I think it's not quite as simple as saying those who have affluence get, they call the shots, and the school system is run differently in independent schools. There's something fundamental here. I think independent schools specialize in explicit instruction, and they readily accept Zoom. And they readily accept synchronous learning. It comes naturally, and kids show up at an independent school expecting to be taught. They are not really all that comfortable with just doing group work, just discussing things, and maybe filing reports. Whereas the approach taken in most of Nova Scotia was that what happened during the pandemic was we know now. It was basically email education. You get an email from your teacher once a week, and if you're lucky, you get 2 times contact via Zoom or Google Classroom, and that was it. But the independent schools, from what we now know, right across Canada, by the way, the heads of the 95 independent schools talked once a week for the first part of the pandemic, and they agreed, number one, that there would be synchronous learning, and there would be an uninterrupted transition to online learning. Now, mind you, the kids all had access to the tools and so on. And if they didn't, and they're much smaller, so it's easier to do that. So they had a lot of advantages going for them. Well, one thing, there was no confusion about what are we going to do now, and who do we have to consult, and all these other issues. And the other thing is privacy issues, which you probably heard, public education. Oh my God, you can't go on Zoom. There may be Zoom bombers, or where's the data going? I don't think anyone in independent education cares. I think they're more interested in what did you learn today, and what have you got to do. Now, here's another thing that's interesting is synchronous learning is part of the new model for the next disruption. There won't be a school system anywhere that isn't more explicit about what teachers are going to be doing with kids, because we learned that the guidelines were too broad, there wasn't enough specificity, and an awful lot of time was wasted. Not enough time was assigned, and a lot of time was wasted. And we now know through all the research that's collecting and all the school board data is coming in, boy, oh boy, we missed opportunities during the emergency home learning experience.
Yeah. Okay, another question from Jennifer. There are 2 pieces you haven't addressed: the impact of outdated curriculum on widening the skills gap, and the impact of unions on the ability of schools to innovate. What are your thoughts?
Outdated curriculum. Well, that's an interesting term. I'm a big believer in evidence-based research, and we should apply cognitive learning research that shows how students learn. And we need to have a knowledge-based curriculum, or a knowledge-rich curriculum. I realize this is heresy, because most people talk only about process. But haven't we learned by now that we need to adjust the equilibrium or the balance and go back? It's tilted too far in the direction of process, assigning things, collecting them, marking them, giving them back to kids. Yeah, well, we know through the pandemic that simply didn't work. So explicit instruction is actually best for reading and math at the early years, and there's tons of research. So outdated curriculum. I am not a great proponent of curriculum reform if the teaching is not effective. What was the second part of that question?
The unions, have they slowed it down?
I think they need to be consulted. I think they were inordinately concerned about what I described, and I've written about this. I wrote this in the National Post. Is kind of worst case scenario social policy. In other words, you look at, oh, these are needs or these are deficits. We can't do anything until every single person has this and every single person has that. And you heard me say that, if we did that when we had a power outage in Nova Scotia, when would all the lights go on if we wanted to fix all the houses and everything else? So I think there needs to be a recognition that you need to build around assets and build from your best cases and try to spread out the best case experiences and not worry so much about the worst case experiences. And here's another thing that's interesting. You know what the survey showed? The one thing our school system did extraordinarily well was see that kids got computers. I don't think they used them, but they actually, they got everybody's email, so they could email them once a week or twice a week. And they succeeded amazingly. In fact, I was surprised at how high the feedback was. And 93% of the students claimed they had access to the internet, and only 13% of students in 3 of our districts didn't have access to the internet. And yet we hear all this about nobody has access. And you know what was the most important thing in technology? They didn't know how to use it. So it was people there to show them how to use the technology that was the problem, not the technology. So we've learned a lot, and hopefully we will be better prepared should we have to default to home learning the next time.
Well, and I guess that's where I was going to go. I mean, are there some specific things that either government or schools, I'm going to keep those separate, need to do to prepare students and teachers for another stay-at-home period?
Yes, I'd be leery about hybrid models. You hear that discussed. That's the logical default for grades 9 to 12. You hear everybody saying we have to go to a hybrid model. Well, show me a hybrid model that's worked. It's a real challenge. And are the teachers going to have double their workload because they're going to be teaching in the school and they're also going to be supervising kids online? Or are we going to have what we have in Ontario, hiring 600 more teachers so they can deliver online courses and they don't talk to the classroom teachers that are in the schools? I believe that's fraught with a lot of difficulty. It's called in Britain, it's called the rota system, the rotational system. And let me tell you, I looked at all the schedules and I can't believe how complicated they are. You think your life as a parent and a student and a teacher is complicated now. Wait until you see the results of that. I think the alternative of everyone being in school, practicing proper social distancing, masking everybody, and trying to carry on as best we can within what we do well, which is operate schools. I think that's far better than any option. So I am concerned about a default to what I would call home learning. It cannot, it should not be anything like what we experienced over that 3-month period.
So we know that education is a provincial responsibility. Should it be a provincial responsibility, or would we just have sort of that greater centralization that you're concerned about if we tried to? And it's probably too late to make it a federal responsibility, but should there be more money for education from the federal government? Should there be more input from the federal government?
More resources, yes. but certainly not more oversight. There's enough oversight in the entire system. My book actually is a pretty extensive case, 300 pages, of how there's more oversight and less transparency and little or no accountability. That's the weird thing about all the superstructures that we've got. But I think what's interesting here is what we've learned. We've learned some lessons. We need to put them to good use.
So just to challenge you for a moment, I mean, it seems that there's a bit of decentralization you're talking about, or more power, certainly inside the schools. Doesn't that rely on great people in schools? I mean, isn't the objective of centralization to try and deliver great programs across the board? What if we don't have great people in all 395 schools?
You won't have great people in all 395 schools. But that is what leadership development should be about. It should be in a province of the size of Nova Scotia. Can't we find, train, and develop 395 people who can lead a school, exercise good judgment, and have responsibility to work with parents? That's a real challenge. And I think there's going to be hits and misses. It's not going to be neat. We know from New Zealand, they did it in 1987. We know it was the first year was incredibly rocky, but they lasted and they improved it and they perfected it. We know from it can be done, and my first recommendation would be to go to Edmonton and study how it happened. My book goes into great detail about the school-based management initiative, who initiated it, what they learned, and we do have a lot of years now. It started in the 1970s, developed in the 80s, and we've got lots of evidence of what works when it comes to school-based management and what needs to be avoided when you delegate to the schools.
You and I have talked in the past about snow days. Nova Scotia has, I think you probably know the number, but more snow days than anybody else in Canada, or close. I mean, you can tell me, you can correct me. Is hybrid education the opportunity that we all need to ensure that kids are busy and learning during the number of snow days that we have in Nova Scotia?
E-learning days are here now, whether the superintendents and those in the system wish it or not. You're right, I sounded like a broken record. It was 10 years ago that I started talking about this. First 5 years I was talking about we need to have replacement days and we need to cancel the school less and we need to make better use of the time. We need to repurpose our professional development days. And then about 5 years ago I said, you know what, I'm tired of this. They're not going to bend. So let's move to e-learning. So I wrote a series of articles and I did some reports on e-learning days. And I was told that was totally impractical. It was not necessary. I said, well, we could have blizzard bags. People made fun of them. There was even a book out that tries to make fun of me for saying that we needed e-learning days. There's not one person now that thinks that's funny, because after 6 months, after 3 months of this disruption, we are perfectly capable of offering e-learning days. And there are 12 states in the United States that have legislation we should look at. There are 6 states, and I can name them, that are exemplary programs. And every one of those states that had e-learning programs to replace storm days or disruption days did much better during the pandemic. There's evidence is coming. They clicked immediately to what they did, they practiced it. Now, here's another thing I learned. Do you know that those e-learning days are not just for snow? I learned that in South Carolina, they're for adverse weather conditions, and they've been used actually during pandemics. I was kind of surprised to see that epidemics were one of the triggers for using e-learning days. I did not see that at all. Dust storms, wildfires, and things like that, and what they're called calamity days in the US for good reason. They're not just storm days. But you're quite right. You know the research. My last report came out a year ago, and it brought things up to date. over a 10-year period from 2008 and 9 to the last 2018-19, we've had double the number of storm days in Nova Scotia. It went from 5 or 6 to 10 to 12. It doubled. And that's while Jim Gunn, Dr. Jim Gunn, and I are out there constantly talking about we need to do something about it. But isn't it interesting that it took a massive international calamity, a global pandemic, to make e-learning days a reality everywhere? I don't think it's debatable. I think it's a matter of doing it well. And what I also learned was there's a formula for making e-learning days work, but it's not sustainable beyond a few days. It's too rigorous for the kids. There's a very, very firm protocol. Here's how it works. 9:30 school starts, you log on, you get your assignments for the day, you complete your assignments, and you can hand them in between 2 p.m. and 3 p.m. And you're not released until you're checked off. Now, that is too onerous if it's going to be for the entire term. Well, can you imagine if we'd attempted that? There would have been mass rebellion. But all those school systems were trained that it was a regular school day. And so they clicked into it. Now, they had to learn to back off. Don't be so, because they couldn't be that far ahead of other school systems that were floundering around. People couldn't find their computers, and they had to send things out, direct mail and things like that. So there's some school systems got far ahead. But we can learn a lot from those with that 10-year experience. Remember, the state of Ohio trained every single one of their teachers in e-learning in 2010. That's something we need to keep in mind.
So we're almost finished. I have one last question, which is, if you could speak to the education minister today, and you could say, here's 2 or 3 things that you can do right now that are going to improve the state of education in Nova Scotia, what would you say?
Great question, and I was kind of expecting it. I would say take heart from what happened during the COVID-19 pandemic. Use those lessons. And what we learned was we need to delegate more responsibility to the schools, to teachers, to principals, to parents, and we need to build them back into the school system. And if you want, dismantle the bureaucratic education state as gently as we can, as minimally disruptive as we can. That's number one. Let's have teaching-centered classrooms. Let's start talking about that. Let's have true parent engagement so that when the next pandemic hits, we have relationships with parents. Let's build new relationships with the business community. And let's start with, what about that preparedness problem? What can we do to ensure that our students are properly prepared for universities, colleges, and the workplace? I know it's a tall agenda, but I think it opens the door for some positive, constructive changes. We need to change the entire dialogue in our educational system.
That's great. Okay, well, thank you very much. Unfortunately, we're out of time, Paul. I really appreciate you joining us today. It seems that time has flown by, certainly for me. As I mentioned, I talk about education a lot at home, so this is great to have the opportunity to discuss it with you. And I think it's very important for our members. I mean, I can't say enough about all of the parents who and the efforts and time they put in with their children for 3 months. Obviously, people are concerned going back to school, but I know many parents that are happy their kids are now back at school in an environment where they can learn more actively, and the parents can get back to work as well. So thank you very much. I look forward to reading your book, The State of the System, available at Bookmark or Amazon if you feel you have the need to order online. If you're looking to get involved with the Chamber, sponsorship is a special way for our members to support us as we're doing webinars like these and events and campaigns. Also bringing back our Chamber Golf Tournament, but I think we're only got 3 people left who can sign up. So hurry and sign up. This webinar has been recorded and will be available to all attendees shortly on YouTube. thank you very much, Paul, for joining us today. And I wish you all the success with your book. I will be buying it for my wife to have her take a look at it as my in-home expert. And I'll be taking a look at it as well. So thank you very much for joining us today.
Thanks. It's been a pleasure. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did.
Great. Thank you. Yeah, it was great. Thank you. Okay. Thank you very much, everyone. We'll see you soon. Thank you.